previous part of this video series, I put together a mech made out of various found objects and resin casts of things like cigarette lighters and yogurt pots. In this second part of the video, I'm going to paint up the piece, add some details to the base, and also add some LED lights to the figure. So the first thing to do is to dismantle the robot into its component parts. I made sure that this wasn't glued together when I was putting it together, and it's mostly held together with screws, so I can now dismantle it to make things easier for myself when I come to paint it. There's so many details and sort of really hard to reach pieces in this that I don't think you could really paint it if you couldn't actually dismantle it into smaller sections. It's also useful to have a degree of flexibility to the pose of the piece as well. It's sometimes difficult to visualise exactly how this is all going to look until it's all brought together. So having some give in the arms and the final pose is really useful. So the first step with this is to give everything a coat of primer. For those of you in the UK, I'm using primer that I got from Halfords. This stuff's just really good. It's quite thick and it covers really nicely and dries very quickly. So I've tried a few primers in my time, but this seems to be the best as far as I've found. The trick with this is just to keep rotating it and giving it lots of light coats to slowly build up the layers of primer. So here are all the component pieces of the robot. As you can see, there's quite a lot of stuff there, so it'll probably take quite a long time to paint all these, but that's cool. And the more detail you have, the better it's going to look. And it's quite striking how once it's got a layer of primer, it sort of brings it all together. Obviously this is made out of pieces of junk and various bits and pieces, so it does look like a bit of a junkyard shop sort of mess without the primer, but having a nice flat even coat really sort of brings all the shapes into focus, I think. So I'm going to start with this engine section. I always find it useful to sort of test your colour scheme on one part before sort of doing the whole thing, just to make sure that all the colours you've chosen sort of work well together. For this particular section of the model, I'm going to do most of it in sort of metallic colours, because I'm sort of thinking of this as being the sort of engine of the piece. I'm figuring that it wouldn't have been painted necessarily and would have been left as bare metal. The rest of the robot will have like body panels which will actually be painted a colour, but for this section it's going to largely be metallic. So what I'm doing is just giving it a dark coat of dark iron, which is a shade from Tamiya. I really like these paints, they're really easy to use and they give a really nice finish, so I found myself using them for most things these days. What I'm intending to do is start with a dark metallic layer and then slowly build up lighter shades to give it some depth and to highlight the raised areas. So I'm now dry brushing on some gunmetal, which is another Tamiya colour as well. So now that my metallic layer is done, I'm now moving on to using some rust pigments. You may have seen me use these on previous projects and they're really nice. So what they are, they're actually powders. What you do is mix them in with something called matte coats, which is basically a pigmentless paint. So you can sort of add any colour to it and it will create a paint from it. So what's really nice about these is that you can add on a layer of rust powder, but then you can make it flow by using a thinner. So I don't want the model to be completely rusted to hell, but I do want it to be weathered. So what I'm doing is using the darker shades in the recesses of the model and then highlighting some of the other sections in slightly lighter colours of rust powder. What I'm then doing is coming in with the thinner and allowing the pigments to flow over the metallic paint job. What that's doing is giving a really light shade of rust. I really find that gives quite a realistic finish. Makes it look like it's been rained on and some sections have started rusting and that rust has flowed over the model and into the recesses. So this is a technique which I'll come back to for other sections of the model. On other projects I've often used oil washes to add a degree of weathering to the final paint finish, and this is sort of doing a similar job. The idea is that you want a black or a dark brown or something like that you can just create a wash, so a thin transparent paint effectively. You can then brush that over the model, it will flow into the details and add a degree of contrast to it, and also just make it look like it's been out in the elements and has sort of picked up some dirt and dust along the way. So that's worked well enough, so I can now turn my attention to the rest of the body. As I said, this is going to actually have some pigments to it rather than being purely metallic. What I'm doing initially is adding some metallic colours to it. What I want to do is have a chipped paint effect, as though the robot had bashed into stuff in the past and some of the paint had been chipped off. Now again, I've covered doing this in the past, And what I'm going to do here is to add metallic colours to the areas where paint would likely have been chipped away. I can then add a masking agent on top of the metallic colours, so when I paint the whole piece in the colours that I'm going to use, I can then rub away where I've put the masking agent and the metallic colours will show through from beneath. So this is a masking agent I'm using. It's a mass score from Humbrol, and that will probably be familiar to you if you've seen some of my previous videos. As with previous projects, what I'm doing is using a sponge to just dab it onto the model in various points. The good thing about the sponge is because I've torn it in a sort of a random fashion, it does give quite a nice irregular shape to the sections of masking agent I'm adding on. So one of the tricks to this really is to make sure that it doesn't look too regular and it does look random, so that will give a more convincing finish once it's all done. So now that my mass colour's dried, I can now start adding my actual paint to the piece. I'm using more Tamiya colours. I'm using light grey here, which actually dries to a slightly bluey colour. And I find that if you apply the paint in a slightly uneven way, maybe even leave a few gaps here and there, it does actually look quite realistic, as though the vehicle had sort of been painted ineffectually by the people who'd done it. I'm adding some slightly darker shades of blue here as well. I'm just trying to add a degree of variation to the colour scheme. I'm also adding some black to certain areas and then giving a metallic finish on the top of that. I also want to add in some red as well, so I figured perhaps the end of these protruding canisters might be red. So now that my paint's dried, I can actually start peeling off the masking agent and revealing the paint beneath. This is one of the more fun aspects of doing this sort of paint scheme, so it can be quite tempting to try and start scraping this away before the paint's fully dried, but that can go a bit wrong. So while it can be tempting to just go for it, it's really worth leaving this for half an hour to an hour to allow the paint to actually set up properly. I think I need a little bit more variation in the colour scheme, so I'm just adding in a red panel here as well. Sometimes it can be difficult to see how all of this is going to come together when you're painting each section individually. Nevertheless, I think this does need a little bit more visual detail to it, so I'm just adding in a bit more colour here and there. As with the engine section, I'm now adding in some weathering pigments. Now I'm not going too heavy with these, all I'm doing is using the darkest of the rust colours that I have, and I'm putting that into the recesses, and as before I'm just using a thinner to allow them to flow over the model. That just adds a layer of weathering and dirt to it, and I find that really sort of brings a degree of realism to the paint scheme. So particularly for light colours like this, it will sort of darken them down slightly, make them look a little bit dirty. And I find that that just suddenly makes them come to life. It can work quite well as well if you add quite a lot of thinner to a particular section and sort of create some drip effects, as though perhaps some oil had been leaking from the machine or something like that. So I'm now turning my attention to the robot's arm, and as you can see I've given this a layer of metallics as well, and I'm now dabbing on some masking agent so I can get a nice chipped paint effect here too. As before, I'm sort of dabbing the paint on and trying to get a sort of a patchwork paint scheme almost, as though the people who had painted this hadn't done a particularly good job. It can also sometimes be worth mixing in some other colours that are sort of very similar but slightly different shades. Just sort of adds a degree of variation to the model, and I think it does help sell the scale of the piece as well. So as before, you can just rub that with your finger to get rid of the masking agent and reveal the metal below. As with the other pieces, I'm adding in some more weathering powders here, and I'm just adding some more thinners to allow it to flow down the model. If it gets too heavy, you can just wipe it away with a cloth. And what that does is sort of remove it from most of the surfaces, but it stays in the recesses. So it sort of adds a degree of contrast and colouring to it. as well as adding some weathering. Now quite a few sections on the model have these open sort of socket things which I've used for like elbows and joints, but I need something to put in the middle of them. Now because they're all the same size, I can use the same piece for all of them. So what I've done is to make these inserts, and the way I've done that is to just machine a few small shapes on the lathe, then make a mould as I have with all the other pieces for this model and run off some casts. So this is what I've come up with, and I'm just going to give that a metallic colouring and then glue it in place. And once it's had a bit of weathering powder added to it, that ties it in nicely with the rest of the piece. So at this stage I just want to put a few of the pieces together to make sure that they all sort of work. Because I'm painting each piece in isolation, it's possible I might sort of drift away in slightly different directions and maybe not get a sort of a cohesive paint scheme across the whole piece. But putting them together, I think that's looking alright. So for the legs it's the same process as for the other pieces. I'm thinking most of these will be entirely metallic except for a few areas here and there. I'm leaving the lower legs unpainted for now. That's just because I want to add some stuff to the base of the model, so I don't want to screw up any paint job I've done on the legs when I come to actually add some pieces to the base. And I think these canisters can be red to make them stand out a little bit. What these actually are copies of the NO2 canisters I used earlier, but they're smaller versions. So what I actually did was to put a small piece of acetal rod into the lathe and then just to file down some curved ends on those and then make a mould and cast up some copies. So once again I've put some of this together just to get an idea of how things are looking. So I've added the engine section and the waist together here, and I think that's looking pretty cool actually. It looks fairly cohesive, it's like a sort of a weathered piece of machinery, so I'm quite happy with that. So I want to add some detail to the base, so what I'm going to do is take some of this polystyrene packing material, cut it up into sections and try and add some contours to the base so it's not all one flat piece. I made sure to have one foot slightly above the other when I was making this, just because I think if you're going to try and have it on sort of natural ground's never going to be completely flat, so you need to make sure the model is not standing exactly straight, and I find that that helps sell the illusion a little bit better. And in order to join all of these pieces of polystyrene together, I just mix up some plaster and I can now paste that onto the base and sort of sculpt it to a degree to create some natural looking ground. Now I have been looking at some of those awesome diorama videos that are on YouTube, people building various woodland scenes and things, so I think you really could go to town with the base if you wanted to. I've always thought that you should pay as much attention to the base as you do to the main sculpture. I generally find it sort of sells the overall piece a little bit better. Now I don't have that much experience with doing dioramas, so I think I'll keep this one simple for the time being, but I do like the idea of doing something quite elaborate and maybe having a robot in a river or something like that. So there's a lot you can do with this, so I think I definitely will experiment for future projects. So the last element to take care of here is some lighting for the model. What I'm using is these LED strips that you can get quite cheaply off Amazon and eBay and places like that. What's good about them is you can chop them up into little sections and then solder them up independently of the main strip. Generally speaking, they're divided into sections of 3 LEDs that you can then solder up and use for projects. So I find these really useful. They run on 12 volts, so you don't have to do any particularly advanced electronics to get these working. What you do is solder some wires to the tabs that you can see here and you're good to go. As you can see, they're pretty bright, so I think that's going to be quite effective. So what I want to do is just to illuminate certain sections of the model to give it a bit of life. So I figured I could put some of these inside the main body, and that would have the effect of shining down the mech and illuminating certain parts of it. And there's a quick test of some in the shoulder joint there. Once I tried this out, it did mean that I needed to put a few additional details into the shoulder just to give it a bit more visual detail. So I've added a few bass strings in there and things like that, just to suggest some mechanisms within the internal structure. What I also want to do is to have some flashing LEDs at the end of these protrusions on the back. Now, I'd sort of thought of doing this halfway through, so I didn't really plan that this is how it should be. So that means I'm going to have to drill some fairly long holes in the mech to actually get the wires through. So I think it is worth planning in advance if you're planning to add lights to a model. Nevertheless, this hasn't proved too difficult, so I'm just drilling a hole through the section here and then threading some wires through. And again, I'm just using pre-wired 12-volt LEDs, so you don't need to worry about any electronics for doing this. You've just got to connect the positive and negative terminals and away you go. So I think that looks quite effective. Now, because I've got LEDs at various other points in the model as well, the inside of the model is becoming a little bit of a tangle of wires. But luckily there's a bit of a space inside the yogurt pot that I use for the main body, so there's enough space in there to contain everything. So there we go, there's my finished mech with lights in place. As you can see, I've got various LEDs across the body. I really do like the effect of the ones that are lighting the internal pieces of the mech. I think that looks quite effective, and it sort of lights it up in a sort of an unexpected way and highlights some of the detail, which I think is really nice. As you can see, I ended up covering the base in some building sand and tileless grounds. I won't go into too much detail about how I made these. As I mentioned, there's plenty of people on YouTube who are doing some really good build videos for dioramas, so if you want to know how all this sort of stuff is done, just go and watch them because they're amazing. I decided to use some of the other parts from the model kit that I used to add detail into the mech and actually make a little sort of truck here. So the implication might be that the mech's destroyed it perhaps, or that it was already there. I've put a flickering orange LED underneath it to suggest that there's some sort of fires burning. And it's really there just to give a sense of scale to the mech itself. So that's it for this project. I've got to say I really enjoyed doing this. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I've been thinking about doing it for a long time and hadn't really got around to it, but now I've had a go, I'm quite hooked and I'm already thinking about ideas for the next robot that I'm going to build. So I can see why so many people are into doing this sort of thing. Anyway, that's it from me for this one. If you've made it all the way through both parts of this video, thanks very much. So until next time, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.